This is Winchester Academy.
Tonight to Mary and Pat Fair for sponsoring our program, recognizing Women's History Month. Theresa Kaminski, Professor of History, University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, brings us a true-life, tangled tale of wartime intrigue. Angels of the Underground, American women who resisted the Japanese in the Philippines in World War II. It has been my privilege to know Dr. Kaminski as a colleague and appreciate up close her significant accomplishments. She has received many honors and awards, among them the UWSP Scholar Award, and twice received a fellowship at UW-Madison's Institute for Research in the Humanities. Angels of the Underground is her third book, focusing on the lives of American women in the Philippines in the 20th century. And Dr. Kaminski very graciously has agreed to raffle off a book tonight. So if you did not register for the drawing, speak over there. You might be the lucky one. Without further ado then, I give you Dr. Theresa.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Sound okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I regularly lecture to some rooms bigger than this, so I'm quite accustomed to adjusting my voice. If anybody needs it, just do something like this, and I can talk even louder. But welcome, and thank you all for coming out tonight. Mondays, I know, the start of a week, so hopefully I'll give you something to be thinking about for the rest of the week. And my specialty is American women's history. I've spent the last 25 years or more studying various aspects of women's history, and as you can see from this first image, I have published on this topic, and all three of these books are kind of variations on the same theme. My first book, Prisoners in Paradise, took a look at American women who were caught in the Pacific Theater once the Japanese attacked at Pearl Harbor. And the second book that I published, called Citizen of Empire, takes a closer look at one of those women from the first book, and she was a woman who was born and raised in Wisconsin. Actually from the other end of the state. She was from southwestern Wisconsin, so if any of you are interested in a more kind of local history approach to bigger historical events, you might want to take a look at that. A lot of libraries have a copy of that book. But what I'd like to talk to you about tonight is my third book. It's been out for about a year now, and that is Angels of the Underground. And this is a story that I first came across when I was working on my first book, because the women I talk about in Angels of the Underground make a much briefer appearance in Prisoners in Paradise. But after I was done with that first book, their stories were still so sharp in my mind, and it was like they were kind of talking to me a lot, and they needed to have a bigger story told. So that's what I did with Angels of the Underground. So the bigger story here. This takes place in the Philippine Islands, and I don't know how familiar many of you are with the Philippines, but this is a set of over 7,000 islands in the South Pacific. And the United States had been interested in the Philippine Islands since the turn of the 20th century. And the United States, I think some of you may be aware, went to war with Spain in 1898. And the major issue in that war Anybody in the loading zone? Okay. Uh-oh. You can hear okay? Okay. Good. Okay, so the Philippine Islands really came to the attention of the United States during that war with Spain that started in 1898 over the independence of Cuba. Cuba was under Spanish colonization, so were the Philippines. And when that war started, the United States figured, well, if they were going to help the Cubans achieve their independence, they might as well do the same for the Filipinos. But the big difference was when that war was over with Spain, the United States extended that independence to Cuba, but did not do the same to the Philippine Islands. The United States government decided that given the location in Asia, that holding on to those islands would be particularly lucrative for the United States, both in terms of economics and in terms of security. The ability to have military bases and a military presence in the Philippines was something that was very attractive to the United States. So beginning at the very start of the 20th century, there were thousands of Americans who started moving to the Philippines. There were business opportunities there, so it wasn't just a military endeavor. There were a lot of civilians who were very much attracted to life in the Philippine Islands. And pretty soon, anybody who was visiting the Philippines, especially the capital city of Manila, could see very plainly the effects of American colonization. In places of Manila, you could easily buy the latest American products. You heard English spoken. You could see a lot of Americans walking down the street. So by the first couple of decades in the 20th century, especially the city of Manila in the Philippines became very Americanized. And there was an attraction for civilians to settle in the Philippines because I don't know if anybody has ever traveled to the South Pacific, but the climate is a lot different than it is in Wisconsin. And there are a lot of people who like that kind of balmy palm tree. So that was a particular attraction. The cost of living for Americans tended to be a lot lower. And for a lot of Americans, it did very much seem to be a paradise for them. If you were a middle-class American, you could live really well in the Philippines. So, it's at this point where I can introduce the first of our angels. And we see her standing there. The photograph on the left is of Margaret Utinsky, who was known by her nickname of Peggy. And she really does look like a Peggy. I think that's a very apt nickname for her. And this is actually a photograph that was taken not in the Philippines, but it was taken in New York when she had actually come back to the United States in 1940 to visit her in-laws. So she's standing here with her brother-in-law and her niece and nephew. And this, I think, is the only surviving pre-war photograph of Peggy Utinsky that exists. Okay. The photograph on the right, the very snappily dressed man in uniform, and some of you may recognize the World War I uniform. This was Peggy's husband, Jack. Jack Utinsky had signed up for military service during the Great War. We don't know a whole lot about that military service, but we do know that as a result of it, he ended up in the Philippines. And he decided to stay there as a civilian. So they actually met not in the United States, but they met in the Philippines. And this is where the story is not quite clear. But as far as I can piece together, Peggy grew up rather poor. And she got married fairly young the first time around. And what happened to her first husband is a bit of a mystery. He apparently died and left her with a small child. And Peggy decided she needed to earn her way in life, and she trained as a nurse. Somewhere, somehow, she got a nursing degree, and she worked full-time to take care of her little boy. And at some point, for some reason, in about the mid-1920s, she decided to go to Manila. Again, not a terribly unusual thing for an American to do. Manila was also considered, if you weren't going to go there to live, to take a vacation there was considered to be, a real opportunity, kind of exotic. And it does seem that Peggy had intended just to go there for a vacation. She took her little boy with her. They went to Manila. I think maybe she either knew some people there already, or she had signed on as a nurse companion, and this was also fairly common at the time. She may have signed on for a nursing job with a particular person who was traveling to the Philippines, and that's how she got there. But however she got there in the mid-1920s, she decided after she met Jack, she didn't want to leave. They probably met at some kind of social occasion for Americans, and he was a little bit older than she was, but not very much. And she was just swept away, absolutely captivated. And Jack was actually living and working not in Manila, but you can see on this larger map here, down to the south of Manila, there's a very heavily fortified island. And for those of you who've studied anything about World War II in the Pacific, the island of Corregidor might ring a bell. And Jack was part of a group of Americans living and working on Corregidor. They were civilians, but their purpose there was to help with the military buildup. Jack was an engineer, and he was employed to help fortify this island. And as you can see with its location, the assumption was that having a heavily fortified Corregidor Island would protect the city of Manila from invasion by water. And the American military was very set on the fact that as long as they had, and you can see the guns there, there was an extensive tunnel system. The Malate tunnels were built into the ground. The American military felt pretty invulnerable there. And Jack was part of the contingent working on this project. So after he and Peggy got married, they settled on Corregidor with her son. And for the remaining years there, up until 1941, Peggy had a very easy life. She didn't have to work anymore. She didn't have to worry about earning a living. Jack took care of all of that. They had very nice accommodations. Anything anybody could want in terms of social things available right there on Corregidor. Anytime they wanted, they could go up to Manila. Long weekends, vacations, all of that was right at their fingertips. So they were leading a pretty good life there. We do know from that first photograph that I showed of Peggy, at some point in 1940, she decided to go back to the United States for a visit. Again, not unusual for Americans living in the Philippines to take what they called a trip home. And her intention This may have coincided with her son's high school graduation. There is evidence that her son went back with her to the States and stayed there. She decided to come back to the Philippines, even though in late 1940 the United States military was advising Americans not to travel to the Philippines. It was sending many of its dependents, its military dependents, back to the United States. But Peggy absolutely refused to be separated from Jack. And she said that despite what was coming, or whatever might come, she wanted to be with her husband. So she actually, in order to get back to the Philippines, she had to pull some strings with the U.S. military. I'm not quite sure how she did it, but she did it. And she got back to Manila, to Corregidor, and to Jack. So that was one of our angels. Our second angel. And this was her real name, okay? Claire de la Taste. She was originally from Michigan, grew up out in Oregon. And all of her life, she wanted to be an entertainer. And I think she had the name for it. She didn't even have to change her name. Perfect for the stage, right? But unfortunately, she was pretty good as a singer and a dancer, but she just never quite made it any further than some local successes. And at some point in the late 1930s, she was traveling around the West Coast with a friend of hers who also, I guess, was kind of an adventurer, very ambitious, and they decided on a lark that they would try their luck in Hawaii. And if they were just kind of a dime a dozen on the mainland, maybe they would be a bigger attraction in Honolulu. Okay. So off they go to Hawaii, and it's not really much better for them there. So then they decide, let's try Manila. And they head off to the Philippine Islands, and Claire actually does pretty well there. She gets some entertainment gigs at reputable night spots. There were some less than reputable night spots in Manila. And actually one that she worked at, and I think that might even be a photograph of it, but one of the ones that she did work at that was still reputable but kind of teetering on the edge was actually run by a well-known American gangster. And if any of you have ever read any of James Clavell's novels, he wrote a book called King Rat. And the main character there was based on that nightclub owner, and that was one of Claire's bosses prior to the war. So if I do talk about this a bit more in Angels of the Underground. So she did pretty well for herself as an entertainer, but Claire was also very much of a romantic. As much as she liked to entertain, she liked to fall in love. And there's been some information surfacing recently that by the time she went to the Philippines, she may have already been married and divorced. I haven't been able to find any documentation about that. But not long after she started appearing on stage in Manila, she met a Filipino named Manuel Fuentes. And this is the only photograph I've been able to find of him taken much later in his life. They met when they were both younger. And she was immediately attracted to him. Of course, he seemed to be very unusual to her. He was Filipino. He traveled a lot. And she was just swept away by all of this. And so actually, not even a year goes by and she's already married. She's given up her stage career and she's leading a rather sedate Manila suburban life with Manuel, and it's not nearly exciting as what she thought it would be. And to try and hold the marriage together, and this part of the story is also a little bit murky, but she presents Manuel with a daughter. There is considerable evidence that this is not her biological daughter. Her husband traveled quite a bit, and it seems the best information I have on this is she actually adopted the daughter of one of her servants and told Manuel when he came home from one of his trips that this was their daughter. And she thought that this would save the marriage. It didn't. She ended up leaving Manuel. She took her daughter, Dian, came back to the States for a little while, realized she still couldn't make it in show business in the United States. So she packed up her daughter and went back to Manila. And she arrives back in Manila during the fall of 1941. So again, not really good timing. And it's not entirely clear how she found passage, but she did. So two of our angels there are in place in and around Manila in 1941. And after Claire's return in 1941, she noticed, and this was very noticeable to everybody who was in the city at the time, the United States military presence was drastically increasing. More American troops were being sent to Manila, again, with the assumption that the American military would always be strong enough to hold off any kind of an attack that the Japanese could throw at them. One of the new arrivals in Manila was a young soldier named John Phillips, who joined the 31st Infantry. I have not ever been able to find a surviving photograph of him, but he showed up at one of the nightclubs that Claire was singing in, and that's how she gets the name that she chose to use then for most of the rest of her life. They fell in love. He was about 10 years her junior. They got engaged. They were planning on a wedding, and the war interrupted those plans. But once again, Claire found herself head over heels. This time, though, it went along very handily with her entertainment career. She was doing very well right on the eve of World War II. And I know that you all have the opportunity to hear another presentation about Pearl Harbor shortly, so here you'll get a bit of a prelude. But this is when everything changes in the Philippines. Okay. And of course, this is not a typo that I have up here, but this has to do with the international dateline. So if you were in Hawaii on Sunday morning, December 7th, that's when the Japanese planes flew over and bombed. If you were in the Philippines on the other side of the international dateline, it was already December 8th, Monday morning. And what a lot of people don't know, because of course the biggest news for mainland America was the bombing of Pearl Harbor. But when the Japanese were done in Hawaii, they started attacking elsewhere in the Pacific. And the Philippines were one of their main targets. The Japanese understood that if they wanted to control the Pacific theater, one of the best ways of doing that would be to knock out the Americans in the Philippines. And so bombing started in the Philippines the same day as Pearl Harbor. And it continued. Whereas everybody knows Pearl Harbor, it was just that one morning and then it was done. Okay, however terrible it was done. With the Philippines, it was almost daily bombing raids. And this is what both Peggy and Claire were dealing with throughout the month of December. For Peggy, her husband, Jack Utinsky, even though he was already a veteran of the First World War, already in his 40s, he joined up with the U.S. military. In fact, most of the American civilian men in the Philippines did the same thing. No matter how old they were, they joined the army. And off they went to try and stop the Japanese. And when Peggy realized what Jack was going to do, she decided to go back to nursing. She figured that the best way she could help as these bombs are starting to fall, she was going to start working in local hospitals. Jack insisted that she stay in Manila. He thought she would be safer there. He didn't want her on Corregidor. Even though it was well fortified, he was worried that the Japanese would try to concentrate too many attacks there. He thought she would have a better chance in Manila, so she stayed there. She rented first a hotel room and then an apartment, and she started nursing for the American Red Cross as these bombs were falling. And for Claire, she was concerned about her daughter most of all. And John Phillips insisted that they get out of Manila. As the bombing raids continued and it became clear that the Japanese were going to be able to invade and occupy the Philippines, John Phillips thought that their best chance for survival was to get out of Manila. And in fact, at Christmas time, General Douglas MacArthur labeled Manila an open city. And by doing this, he protected the civilian population there and the city's infrastructure. Because when one side in a conflict designates a city an open city, it's a signal to the opposing forces that that city will not be defended. Okay? So the Japanese would have no reason, in other words, to fight their way into Manila and to try and destroy the city. Okay? And in declaring this an open city, MacArthur withdrew his troops into the Bataan Peninsula. And again, by saying the word Bataan, I think most of you know then, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But John Phillips with the 31st Infantry, his unit was heading to Bataan, and he thought that Claire and Dian would be safer following the army. So he came and he packed them up and they piled in her car and drove down to the Bataan Peninsula. And she stayed there, and in fact, it wasn't an outrageous move. A lot of other civilians from Manila were doing the same thing, thinking they would be safer outside of the city. And Claire and her daughter did find hospitable Filipinos who took them in, usually for a nominal rent. And Claire spent her days helping to prepare food and do laundry for the 31st Infantry. So her days were busy as well. And in the meantime, the Japanese did invade the Philippines. They occupied Manila on January 2nd of 1942. They, well, some of them just walked into the city. Some of them were on bicycles and just rode into the city and set up their occupation. Peggy, as a nurse, was still there. Claire and Dian were down in the Bataan Peninsula. And the U.S. troops there were betting, and it was a race against time. They were betting they could hold out there against the Japanese until the United States military could send in reinforcements. They didn't know how much had been destroyed at Pearl Harbor. They didn't know that there were no reinforcements to come. Okay. So it's been described as like stuffing cats into a sack and then tying up the top. And that's what happened to the U.S. military there in the Bataan Peninsula. As the fighting started heating up on Bataan, because the Japanese then did head after the U.S. troops there, the fighting there in February, March became pretty intense. And at some point, Claire did get separated from John Phillips. There's too many Johns and Jacks in this story. I'm sorry, and I'm adding another one here. So Claire gets separated from John Phillips. And in her attempt to find him, she happens across some other American soldiers who have been separated from their units and who have decided at this point that the formal fight against the Japanese is probably over with, and the best thing they can do is to pull together guerrilla forces. Okay. That they are going to stay behind and fight against the Japanese in the hills. And one of these men was John Boone. Okay. And we see him, I always get them mixed up. I think he's the one leaning up against the wall. With him is another well-known guerrilla from the time, Edwin Ramsey. Okay. And it was John Boone that Claire Phillips ran into on Bataan. She was looking for John Phillips, hoping to find him. She found Boone instead. And Boone told her what he had in mind, that he was going to be collecting other men like him who were detached from their units. They were going to stay away from the Japanese, and they were going to start guerrilla warfare. And he told her that they would be much more successful if they had somebody who could act as a contact and a coordinating person for their efforts. And he suggested that she be that person, and that she do it from the capital city of Manila. When he first made this proposal, she was reluctant to leave Bataan because she still thought she could find John Phillips, and she wanted to know what happened to him. He did actually survive that Japanese attack, only to be taken prisoner by the Japanese. And she did find out, once she found out what happened to him, then she made the decision to go back to Manila, okay, because she wanted to find a way to help the guerrillas, and she wanted to find a way to help the prisoners like John Phillips, because she had a sneaking suspicion that the Japanese were not going to be treating their prisoners very well. And John Phillips was not a part of the Bataan Death March. He, because of the particular way he was captured, he did not have to undergo this ordeal. Peggy Utinsky's husband, Jack, also was not part of the death march. He had actually gotten off of Bataan and made his way back to Corregidor, where he was later captured. So both of those men were spared this particular ordeal. And again, I think most people who've heard anything about the war in the Pacific know about the death march. The surrender at Bataan in April of 1942, this was the largest surrender of American forces since, Appomattox, and coincidentally on the same day. So kind of odd historical coincidences there, but very different. Remember, General Grant just told the Confederates, go home, lay down your arms, go home. The Japanese certainly didn't behave that way. Their code of warfare, they don't understand surrender. And so they saw no reason to treat these men particularly well. And they were overwhelmed with the size of the forces who surrendered. They were not prepared to take that many prisoners. So they simply started marching these men 60 miles to the nearest railroad station, where they were then put on, shoved into boxcars and taken to a prison camp. And we don't know how many people died along this death march, but it was in the thousands, both Americans and Filipino soldiers. Oops. The prisoners ended up at two camps, first at Camp O'Donnell, which we see up on the left, and then at Cabanatuan. O'Donnell was a temporary prison. Cabanatuan was the one that lasted for the duration of the war. For those of you who've read the book or seen the movie, The Great Raid, this involved liberating the remaining American prisoners at Cabanatuan. And news of the death march and news of the conditions in these prisons reached the civilian population in Manila. So both Claire Phillips and Peggy Utinsky were there, hearing about what had happened, horrified at the conditions that these men were facing. And both of these women faced an additional problem. Being American women in Manila, after January of 1942, their presence outside of a civilian internment camp was illegal. The Japanese occupation forces, after they walked into Manila, started registering Allied nationals and then started rounding them up for internment. So as American women, Claire and Peggy should have been in an internment camp. So they could not freely walk the streets of Manila unless they had false identity papers. And Peggy Utinsky solved this problem first by, when you have a problem, where do you go? You go to your local priests, right? So in her neighborhood was, it was called a convent, but it was not a convent of nuns. It was actually a group of Irish priests. And she went to visit the priests for assistance in having false identity papers made up. She figured her last name of Utinsky sounded Eastern European enough. She knew that Germany had occupied Lithuania, so she figured the Japanese would kind of look at Lithuanian citizens as kind of allies. And so she had false identity papers made up in the name of Rosina Utinsky and gave her nationality as Lithuanian. And by being in league with the Irish priests, these men also were starting to use the convent grounds for the benefit of civilians. They turned the school into a hospital, and they were using the humanitarian comings and goings of the Malate convent as a cover for soliciting and distributing aid to the military prisoners. And that's what Peggy Utinsky tapped into from the very beginning. She worked with these Malate priests in Manila. Then, using her new identity papers, she got a position with the newly formed Philippine Red Cross and started taking medical trips into the Bataan Peninsula, where she was trying to find her husband, or trying to find out what happened to him, and trying to figure out ways to make contacts with men who were being taken to Camp O'Donnell. So she's trying to orchestrate this incredible network of supplies and information to get into these prison camps. And she's being aided by these Irish priests. And she did pretty well with this for nearly a year. And she did realize at some point that Japanese occupation officials were watching her. Because as much as she had papers that said she was Lithuanian, every time she stepped out on the streets in broad daylight and a Japanese soldier saw her, they originally started running after her, you know, American, American. And she was, and you couldn't tell from the picture, but she was about my size, flaming red hair, blue eyes, pale skin. You know, she just looked extremely Caucasian. And so the Japanese were watching her, and they had an idea that she was not who she said she was. And what they assumed was that she had just had these false identity papers made. They hadn't really made the connection with the smuggling network into the military prison camps, which was actually good for her because she did get arrested. She was arrested by the Japanese. She was taken to Fort Santiago in Manila. And this is where the Japanese took all of the people who were opposing the occupation in one way or the other. And Peggy was there for about 30 days. And for almost every one of those 30 days, she was tortured. And she was tortured. And she did not give up any information about who she was working with and how this, and she didn't. I mean, she denied she had anything to do with anything that was going on in the city. She said she was a Lithuanian. She was nursing. She was trying to help anybody who was sick or injured. She didn't know anything about anything else. And she got lucky, okay, because she didn't break under torture. And the Japanese, not finding any other incriminating evidence against her, released her. This was really a stroke of fortune because most people who went into Fort Santiago did not come out. So she got out of Fort Santiago after 30 days of torture. She was pretty much, I think, both physically and psychologically broken at this point. She did undergo some extensive surgery after this. She had all sorts of problems that had to be corrected. And she spent the next few months pretty much lying low and trying to stay out of anybody's line of sight until she could figure out what to do. In the meantime, Claire Phillips had also gone back to Manila, but in doing so, she faced the same problem that Peggy did. She was an American woman. But and this is not Claire, this is an interestingly doctored photo that was taken just after the battle for Manila ended in 1945. It's the only known surviving photograph of Club Tsubaki, which was the nightclub that Claire Phillips started in 1942. But that's not her, that's just some random whack who happened to be there in 45. So this is what Claire Phillips did. She also had false identity papers made. She had it a little bit easier in terms of physical appearance because she had dark hair, she had dark eyes, and her skin was a darker tone that very easily tanned. And so she, in preparation for her move back to Manila, she spent a lot of time outside and made sure that she got darker. But when she got back to Manila, she actually made some contacts with her first husband's family, the Fuentes family, who helped her get false identity papers showing that her parents were Italian, but had lived in Manila, so she'd been born in the Philippine Islands to Italian parents, and then was married to a Filipino because she used the name Fuentes. And she used that false identity to open up a nightclub. And she called this the Tsubaki Club. And she specifically chose this word because it's Japanese for, I think it's the camellia flower, which is supposed to be rather rare and very desirable. So her intention was a nightclub right near the Manila docks that would cater to the Japanese occupation authorities, military and civilian. And her intention, of course, was to use this nightclub as a clearinghouse for information that would be gleaned from the customers and then sent on to John Boone and his guerrillas. And the guerrillas who were operating in the hills and mountains of Luzon did gradually make contact with MacArthur's headquarters in Australia, so there was actually communication going on. So she's using the nightclub as a base for that, and at some point she does meet Peggy Utinsky. I'm not exactly sure how, but it had to do with Claire still trying to find out what happened to John Phillips. And somehow Claire heard about Peggy and Peggy's contacts with various prisoners. And she did ask Peggy Utinsky for help in finding John Phillips. And after the two women met, they kept in touch with each other. And Claire also then used the nightclub for a place where donations for the prisoners could be brought, and then food, clothing, medical supplies, all of those things smuggled into the prison camps. And Claire's operation lasted a little bit longer. But in the spring of 1944, at Cabanatuan, the Japanese figured out what was going on. I suspect that they always kind of knew, because they knew they weren't providing much in the way of supplies for these prisoners. Okay? Yet somehow the prisoners ended up with things. Okay? So clearly there was something going on, but for the most part the Japanese didn't seem to care as long as they got a cut of something and as long as it wasn't too blatant. But something happened to change their minds in the spring of '44. Probably had to do with the way the war had been turning. And they caught some of the smugglers that were bringing in supplies, and they were being smuggled in on these carabao carts. These big animal carts that were brought in. Some of what was in there were legitimate supplies, but the rest was smuggled stuff. And once the Japanese exposed that, they just kept pulling threads until they hit all the way back to Manila, and Claire Phillips was arrested. And she managed to get her daughter Dian into safe hands when the Japanese arrested her. And her daughter Dian actually ended up in Peggy's custody. So again, this is This is kind of an interesting story because after Peggy finds out that Claire's been arrested, Peggy's worried about the little girl. So she goes and she finds out where Dian is, and she offers to take her. And Peggy has made contacts with the guerrillas in the hills as well. So she takes this little girl with her into the hills of Luzon and spends the final months of the war as the Americans are reinvading the Philippine Islands. Peggy is there with guerrilla forces, nursing her way through these last months and weeks of the war with this little girl with her, not knowing Claire's fate. Okay. Claire ends up in Fort Santiago. She too is tortured. But unlike with Peggy's case, Claire does admit to her part in a scheme to assist prisoners, but she said she does it out of humanitarian concern. She's not pro-American, she's not pro-anybody, she just wants to help people. The Japanese are not quite so lenient with her, and they actually sentence her to 10 years at hard labor, and she gets shipped off to a women's prison just outside of the city of Manila, and she spends the last months and weeks of the war incarcerated in a women's prison. So these two angels survive. Okay. And they left behind, I think, very incredible stories. Both of these women took time after the war was over with to write their stories. And you can still find, if you've got quite a bit of money, because these are now rare copies, they're hard to find and they're pretty pricey now. But Peggy Utinsky wrote about her experiences. She called her book Miss U, and the letter U here, that was what she called her network for aiding the prisoners. She would sign her notes that went into the prison camps simply as Miss U, and then the prisoners would know that they actually had legitimate contact with the outside. And she chronicled her story in this book. And she was awarded the Medal of Freedom. And this is not the same Medal of Freedom we hear about today. You know, every year there's a big ceremony and lots of people get these medals for a variety of different reasons. But this Medal of Freedom had been implemented by President Truman as a way of honoring civilians outside of the United States who had aided the war effort. And Margaret Utinsky was one of the first to be awarded this Medal of Freedom in recognition for her work. And the United States Congress also passed a special bill that reimbursed her for the money, the personal money she spent on supplying those military prisoners, because while Peggy was soliciting donations from all sorts of people in Manila, she was liquidating her own assets. She sold just about everything she owned, including the engagement ring that Jack had given her, all to make sure that prisoners had what they needed. And she was rewarded by Congress with a reimbursement. Claire Phillips also survived her, not 10 years at hard labor, of course. She was liberated by U.S. troops, and this happened shortly after that great raid at Cabanatuan. Those liberating forces were not quite done, and they happened upon her prison and liberated her. And Claire also wrote her story called Manila Espionage. And if you've seen the movie The Great Raid, You may remember not actually Claire from that, but there is a Peggy Utinsky character in that movie, which is really a Hollywood depiction of Peggy Utinsky. But for Claire Phillips, who had made a living as an entertainer, she saw the entertainment value in her story. And so writing a memoir for her was a prelude to actually getting a movie contract. This was her dream that was actually fulfilled. She also received a Medal of Freedom. And I think, though, what may have honored her even more, not that she wasn't thrilled with this, but she did have a movie made from her memoir. And we see her in a publicity still from this movie. She's pictured there on the left in the suit. On the right, does anybody, any film buffs here? Anne Dvorak?
Yes.
She was apparently pretty popular, mostly in the 30s, but Hollywood did actually decide, it took quite a while, Hollywood did actually decide that this was a story for the bigger screen. It wasn't an A-list movie, it was a B movie. You can actually find copies of it, and it really is a B movie. You can, the backdrops, the sets and everything, and the story has also been kind of altered, and the title gets changed to an even more, desperate sounding, I Was an American Spy. So in 1951, Claire Phillips does have this additional flash of fame when the movie comes out. The movie, unfortunately, doesn't do very well. The New York Times said, it was kind of an earnest effort, but nothing terribly unusual about it, they found. So those are the two main women in Angels of the Underground. There are a couple of others. I just want to mention them here in kind of supporting roles, if we're carrying on that Hollywood metaphor. Another American woman named Gladys Savory, who had been married to a Frenchman, which gave her the legal ability to remain outside of internment. She used her freedom also to find ways of helping prisoners, both civilian and military. And kind of an unusual case here, Yai Panlilio. We see her seated with the big cameras there, of both American and Filipino heritage, a journalist, a reporter, who, when the Japanese attacked, fled to the hills of Manila and joined one of those guerrilla bands and spent the duration of the war. She wasn't really as much of a fighter as she was an organizer, but still she lived in great danger for the remainder of the war until the Americans came in and liberated. And in the end, we have women who survived a tremendous ordeal and then promptly dropped out of history. Most of the stories, I think, that we all hear about World War II are about the men. This story is about the women who helped the men. And my final plug here, if you ever read a book and like it, whether it's Angels of the Underground or something else, you can always help out an author by leaving a review on one of these websites. It does really matter. So thank you all, and I'll be happy to take questions.
I was in the Marine Hospital in 1953 in Chicago, and I ran into Margaret Utinsky and got to know her pretty well. We'd play cards together mainly, and everything you said, I can remember her telling. A couple of, one or two other things was, well, she showed me the scars. Her fingers, they put in her hands, or they put cigarettes out on her hands. They tore her fingernails off. And her shins were all cut up and scarred because they made her kneel on split bamboo.
Yeah.
The other thing is, the main thing she said she smuggled into the GIs was money.
Mm-hmm.
Was
small amounts.
They let them buy stuff, but they didn't have any money, so she'd give them the money.
Yeah.
And then she told me just about everything you said, so no sense of repeating it. So.
But thank you. I'd like to talk to you after, if that's okay. If you're going to stay, I'd just like a moment with you before you leave.
And I do have that green book, Miss You.
Yeah, I own a copy too, and an autographed one. Not that I ever met her, of course, but yeah, I'm very happy that I own a copy of it too. But it's great to meet somebody who actually met her. You're the first person I've met that has actually met her, so thank you.
A long time ago.
And that's, I mean, that sounds very much like Peggy, because after the war, and especially when she was touring with her book, this was how she kind of kept herself alive, was by doing some nursing jobs and selling copies of her book. So she did, and she did especially like to show up at veterans hospitals.
Well, before you launched into the story of the movies being made, all I could think of is your book would make a wonderful movie, and I would think the time is right now, because who thought about the women in the hills of the village?
Yeah, exactly, and that, I keep trying to send this message to Hollywood, but so far, but actually I should say, this is the first book I've written that has been represented by a literary agent, and she has been contacted probably 3 or 4 times by people who at least had an initial interest, but then it just never went anywhere. So, but I agree. And I think if not a movie, at least one of those nice HBO miniseries, wouldn't you think?
Did either of them ever meet their husbands again?
Oh, no. Yeah, I kind of dropped that thread. But both Jack Utinsky and John Phillips died in those prison camps. Neither one of the men survived. And again, that was not unusual. Just the horrible death rates, especially early on. Jack Utinsky, because he was older, it was much harder on him. And Phil, or John Phillips, probably because he was kind of young, and also that might not have worked in his favor.
Yeah, in the Ken Burns series about World War II, there was one of the featured people throughout the series was this woman and her family that were, I think it was in that last slide, Santo Tomas.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Did you have any input in that? Or?
No, Ken Burns did not call me for that. But if you're interested in more of that, what you saw in the Ken Burns documentary, my first book, Prisoners in Paradise, most of that takes place within those civilian internment camps. So places like Santo Tomas, which was the much more common experience for the American women who were caught there in the Pacific, being crowded, and Santo Tomas, of course, being a university campus, an interesting place for internment.
I have a question.
Sure.
In the beginning of your talk, you talked about the Americans going to and from Manila and going home for visits, whatnot. Were they flying or going by boat?
No, they were going by boat. Yeah, ship, sorry.
Ship.
I keep thinking little paddle boats. I'm not sure. There were Pan Am clippers, but I don't think that kind of distance was very routine. And most of the people really wouldn't have been able to afford that. It was hard enough to afford a ship's passage. And so that was only done occasionally.
Gotta be more questions.
There's one in the front here too, and we'll get to you.
We always felt we had to get even with Pearl Harbor just a little bit. So being stationed over there, some of our boys, the Japanese boys that worked for us, would steal the boys' cigarettes. And so they said, well, how are we gonna, kill them for that? And do it nicely. Well, they said, you get me the gunpowder out of a couple of 30 caliber bullets, and I'll unload one of these cigarettes and drop about an inch of gunpowder in. And I tell you, that was the best cure for stealing and smoking cigarettes I've seen in a long time. Because he lit it up, and it went whoosh, and he jumped up in the air and hollered and screamed. And when I left there, who was the guy that came down and cried? It was that same guy that smoked that cigarette. I probably cured his smoking for life.
And there is a question up front here too. Been waiting. I don't know who's.
Just a question about the Irish priests at the convent.
Mm-hmm.
Why did the Japanese not send them to an internment camp?
The Japanese could be kind of inconsistent, and I think that sometimes they did kind of respect religious figures, and especially since the priests, publicly they were running a hospital for Filipino civilians, and that was something that the Japanese could see was very worthwhile. So, and those Irish priests actually did not, I can't remember if all of them died or all but one, but they also ultimately did not fare very well. The Japanese did come in and question them, look around, so their life was not scrutiny free, but they were willing to kind of let that go.
I've got a question back here. Theresa, have you been to the Philippines?
I have not.
Okay.
And it just about kills me that I've never been there. But as a historian, everything that I write about is gone. So I can't really see these places as they were.
Well, my question, and I don't know if you have an answer for this exactly, but in a 75-year, retrospect now that we away from the actions you're talking about, how the Filipinos today may perceive the invasion, both Japanese and American, how they look at that compared to how we might look at that.
Very bad.
Excuse me?
It's very the older people that were born in Hawaii, that came from the Philippines to Hawaii.
Mm-hmm.
They still the people that were born that moved came from the Philippines. The horror stories are very atrocious. So the older people still have bad feelings about the Japanese. Now in Hawaii, I was born on the island of Lanai, and we had 4 people that did go to the internment camps, never came back. And the only reason that the Japanese people in Hawaii did not go to the internment camps is they had a governor, his last name was John Burns, I think he was John Burns. But when he decided to run for the governor of Hawaii, the only reason he got there is because the Japanese in Hawaii said he was the one that stopped most of the Japanese people going to the internment camps. But there were still, when I was growing up, there was still a lot of animosity towards the Japanese people, but not if they were my grandparents came over in the 1920s.
Okay.
And so if they came over to work in, in the fields and stuff, then they kind of mind their own business, but the other ones, it's really sad. And if you read some of the stories about some of the men that wrote stories about being in the Philippines, it makes you sick to your stomach.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to see. I don't think they can understand this stuff. But and I'm not trying to say your pronunciation of words, but if you went to Hawaii, they wouldn't know how you're pronouncing Bataan. It's Bataan, and it's no, I can't say it.
Yeah, I've got very American pronunciations,
Well,
I know.
American
Yes.
So it's kind of like, huh?
Yeah.
But, I mean, you're doing well. I mean,
Well, and it's from all of my reading, when the Japanese invaded the Philippines, the Filipinos were not really welcoming them with open arms. They did understand the realities of the occupation, what you need to do to survive, but so many of the guerrilla forces in the Philippines were made up of Filipinos. I mean, there were Americans there, but you have a whole lot of Filipinos who are also just doing everything they can to undermine the Japanese, and that would be, an entirely separate book. And lots of books have been written about that too.
I did live in the Philippines for 3 years, from 2010 to 2013, and the older people did speak about how awful those times with the Bataan death march
Yes.
was, and
So they say Bataan?
Bataan is
Okay.
like how they pronounce it.
Okay.
Yeah, I actually got to see the whole area. I got to see Corregidor and a lot of these historical places while I lived there. I was a teacher over there for those 3 years. And
Yeah, I'd really like to. I know that usually they do a death march walk, and
they
I'd
do.
kind of like to do that.
I think you would love it over there. It's just a wonderful place to live, and the people are very warm and kind. They love Americans. They do remember that we helped them during those times. All the ages there.
Yeah.
Very kind to everybody. So.
Thank you.
When I got drafted in 1968 and went to Fort Campbell, Kentucky for basic training, one of my drill instructors was a Filipino. He was 5 feet tall. I still remember him. His name was Sergeant Vega, and he was one tough mother.
Well, and I know that the Filipino scouts were a very elite force there, so.
We've got time for one more question, and then we're going to do what we've all been
Oh,
waiting
the
all
raffle.
night for, the drawing.
Yeah.
I was in Zwicky, Japan, 1952, and we were kicked out of Korea, and that's why they opened up this old camp, Air Force base for the Japs. And I was acquainted with a sergeant that was in the Bataan Death March, and he said one thing about them dirty little bastards. They, as you were marching along, those kids, he called them kids, in the trucks, would put a rifle out and they'd see how many heads you could hit as they drove by.
Yeah, the stories of the Death March are really pretty horrifying. But what I know about the Philippines mostly comes from my father, who was a bit too young for World War II. He kept trying to enlist, but he was about my size, and they kept laughing at him and sending him home. But he joined right after. He joined the Army right after World War II, so he spent time actually in occupied Japan and in the Philippines, and did his stint in the Korean War. So I kind of grew up on stories of Japan and the Philippines, and maybe that's how I got interested in this. But the raffle basket is out there. Anybody who needs a last call.
In the basket that wants to be.
And if you don't win a copy of the book, I do have free bookmarks back there. I know it's a small consolation prize, but
It's all free. There's no money returned.
Yeah. No, sorry, I didn't bring any extra books. But if you take a bookmark, it has the information on it.
Everybody else in that wants to be? Amazon.
Yeah, Amazon.
Maurice, while we actually pick a name, Maurice is a past president of the Winchester Academy Board of Trustees, and he happens to be handy right here on the aisle.
Oh, another former member, Carol Emery.